I think we're going to get started here. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening for the U.S.-North Korea Summit, a real-time assessment here with my guests, Sean King and George Lopez. My name is Patrick Deegan. I happen to be the Associate Director of the Leo Institute for Asia and Asian Studies. Before I start everything off, I just want to give a quick thank you to the Kroc Institute for Peace Studies and the Leo Institute for Asia and Asian Studies, as well as some of the key players that have helped us out: Megan McNichols, Chris Cox, Hannah Heinzeker, Christy Flaherty, Andre Ratasep, and Lisa Gallagher. Thank you for making this event happen in the background and bringing all of us together. Quick note on the format tonight. It'll be roughly 15 minutes from each of our presenters to discuss what's occurring right now between the US and North Korea in Hanoi, followed by discussions and questions from our audience. So let me get started by giving a quick introduction and a little bit of a note. Just by way of trivia, Friday will be the 100th anniversary of the Korean independence movement, which is May 1st. So since we're talking about Korea, I thought, well, why not bring that in? Sean King, directly to my right here, is the Senior Vice President for Park Strategies. He's been there since 2006. Pretty clearly, his focus is Asia, economy, business, politics. And as a result, he regularly comments on current affairs, places such as Time Magazine, Bloomberg, South China Morning Post, Business in Vancouver, many others. Prior to that, he was at the United States Department of Commerce in Washington, where he served as Senior Advisor for Asia and the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service. And before that, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Citibank, New York State Department of Economic Development, on whose behalf he led a trade mission to Taiwan. His undergraduate degree is from American University, but most importantly, I think, his MBA comes from the University of Notre Dame. And the best for last, I like to think, he's also an affiliated scholar with the Leo Institute. So welcome, Sean. Thanks for being here. And let me make a quick introduction for our next speaker, George Lopez, who almost needs no introduction in this, the Hesburgh Auditorium. I feel like he actually maybe has a named seat out here. He's the Theodore Hesburgh Professor Emeritus of Peace Studies. He is, among so many things, also a leading expert on economic sanctions, peace building, human rights, and various peace-related issues. And during his 30 years of affiliation with the Kroc Institute, are we approaching 40 yet, George? Is it?
I'm not.
No. Okay. He's engaged in a diverse set of policy and public roles, including many advising roles with the U.S. government and the United Nations, as, of course, you might realize, an expert on sanctions issues ranging from limiting humanitarian impact to the design of targeted financial sanctions. And because of our topic tonight, but rather he is an expert on North Korea, and that's why he's here with us this evening. He's an author of more than 40 articles, book chapters, 6 books, just a really long CV to expand upon, and currently conducting research with United Nations University for an edited volume currently titled The Sanctions Enterprise, Assessing a Quarter Century of UN Action for Peace, Security, and Human Rights. And like Sean, he too is affiliated as a faculty fellow with the Leo Institute. So Sean, why don't you start us off?
Great. Thanks, Patrick. Always great to be back on campus and see so many familiar faces, including new friends in recent years like Julia, Jessica, Michelle, and Harry, but also my oldest, longest, best friend in the room, Bill Nichols, who was my accounting professor. He let me pass 20 years ago, and he was also the associate dean at the MBA program. And I've stayed at his house upon return visits. So, Bill, thank you very much. I'm at Park Strategies. It's a business advisory firm managed by former Senator Alfonso D'Amato. He's a pretty colorful character. He says his own opinions, but anything I say is my opinion and my opinion alone. Also, I've been to South Korea more times than I can remember. I've stood at the DMZ. I've stood at the northern side of the negotiating table, but I've never actually crossed into North Korea proper because I'm not sure they'd let me out. And 2, I don't want to give the regime any money. But I also visited East Germany 4 times, so maybe it makes me a hypocrite, but that's that. I just want to get that out of the way. Also, I don't speak Korean, but I do speak Swedish, and Sweden is the protecting power of the United States in North Korea. So if I'm ever abducted, I'll get a visit from the Swedish ambassador in jail, and that could come in handy. I was okay with the Singapore summit because North Korea has always said that South Korea is an illegitimate colonial puppet state of the United States, and relations with the United States should be bilateral around South Korea. But Kim Jong-un took a step down by asking South Korea to bring its invitation to Trump at the White House in March 2018. I thought that was very important and a victory for the U.S.-South Korea alliance. It would have been a slap in the face to our South Korean ally not to meet Kim under those circumstances. And I never expected Kim Jong-un to denuclearize anyway, or to make a denuclearization offer that we could accept, because there's only one way he would denuclearize, and I don't want to ponder that. I'll get to that at the end. I also happened to be in Singapore 2 to 3 days before the summit, was able to take in some of the excitement and hubbub leading up to it. However, was very dismayed by the outcome of the summit, not because I expected Kim to denuclearize, but two things in particular. The declaration distressed me greatly. People have called it vague. It wasn't vague at all. It was very detailed along North Korean propaganda narrative lines. The sequencing of events is what troubles me. First, it says we shall have U.S.-North Korea relations, presumably around South Korea. Second, peace regime, very dangerous. 3, then complete, underline complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Despite what Mike Pompeo says on Meet the Press, this does not mean North Korea's denuclearization. It means an end of the U.S. nuclear umbrella of South Korea, Japan, a rollback and withdrawal of U.S. troops, and then maybe North Korea would get rid of its nukes. But it's not denuclearization as we think of it. Also, and then the POW and MIA remains, which was 4th on the list. And, you know, my heart goes out to those families, and that was very positive, and I'm happy to see those remains come back. However, other remains have come back in the past. And what's interesting is that North Korea has gone out of its own sequencing. So maybe that gives us an excuse to rejigger things. But Trump seems locked into the Singapore Declaration. So that gives me cause for concern. Most surprisingly, shockingly, and I was watching the press conference live at 6 a.m. when it happened, I was awake for 33 hours because I just come back from Singapore, was that Trump unilaterally suspended U.S.-South Korea military exercises as a result of his private one-on-one meeting with Kim before the summit. Now, in Hanoi this morning, before their dinner, which was open to press, Kim and Trump met privately for 20 minutes just with translators. This is just like what happened with Putin in Helsinki. So God knows what they've already discussed. For all we know, the Kim summit too is effectively over because everything's already been pre-baked between them, but we'll never know, and probably Mike Pompeo won't either. The fact that Trump would unilaterally cancel U.S. military exercises and then on live TV call them war games and say that his own country's military exercises are provocative is very distressing and would be an alarm to U.S. allies in the region, particularly Japan, and was a big win, not just for North Korea, but also for mainland China. I think Kim's goal is just to get Trump alone in a room around the staff. Don't deal with the people who know the issues. He's taking advantage of Trump's knowledge gaps on the issue. Last year, I remember Trump saying, hey, did you realize the Korean War never ended? Like, yeah, anybody who's taken a class on this knows that after the first 5 minutes. So they're taking advantage of that. But this whole idea of Trump being played, I'm not so sure. I think that they have watched Trump over the years, going back to his first flirtation with president in 1988, where he's always wanted to bring troops home. And he said this in the press conference. He's always saying we spend too much money on troops overseas and what countries taking advantage of us on trade. I think with a nationalist left government in the South, and it's very important you mentioned that with the March 1st declaration, because Moon Jae-in, Korea is counterintuitive. It's one of the few countries in the industrialized world where the political left is more nationalistic than the right. So Korea's left often accuses the right conservatives of not being purely Korean enough. And this president, he recently said that the true founding of the Republic of Korea is not 1948 after the Second World War, but March 1st, 1919, when the March 1st movement started. Now the summit's going to end tomorrow. That means if whatever wins Kim gets, as what he sees himself as the rightful ruler of all Korea, he can introduce these wins from Trump on March 1st, on the 100th anniversary of the Korean nation. And now he has a Korean president in the South who agrees that is the beginning of the country. So that's troubling. But if it doesn't work out, denuclearization from North Korea, it's not Trump's fault. We have to remember who the aggressor here is. Just a little history. 1945, we divided the Korean Peninsula, U.S. troops in the South, Soviets in the North. 48, Soviets leave the North. 49, we leave the South. 1950, North Korea attacks South Korea. Then we enter the war, leading the UN command. We push them back. We liberate Pyongyang. Mainland China comes in, pushes us back to the DMZ, and then we end in this armistice in 1953. Don't blame the victim being the civilized world. It's North Korea's fault we're in this position in the first place. And I also don't buy this thing that nuclear weapons are necessary for North Korea's security, because if we wanted to attack North Korea, we would have done it before they got nukes. The fact is the conventional threat on Seoul, on our alliance commitments to South Korea, is reason enough to stop us for attempting a decapitation or regime change in the North. The security guarantee that North Korea needs is from its own people. North Korea brands itself as an ethno-nationalist state, the true Korea. This is why it cannot open up. Vietnam is not an example, or maybe it's the wrong example for North Korea, because if they open up and their people see what's out there and they see that there's a richer, bigger, ethnically similar, homogeneous state to the South, people are going to ask, what reason does the Kim regime have to exist? Why are you here? So the Vietnam lesson for Kim Jong-un is not have good relations with the US and open up your economy. It's wait for US troops to leave South Korea, unite or confederate under Kim rule, and then open up. But North Korea cannot exist long term so long as South Korea is there or strong as an independent nation. So what they need to do is they need to neuter South Korea, get it weak, and have the US leave. And that's the only situation under which I would see North Korea denuclearizing. Trump's bragged a lot since Singapore. He likes to talk about himself. Reminds us he went to Wharton, that he's a smart guy, thinks he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. Just like, let's look at a few things that he said he's done since the summit. He says the detainees and US prisoners have come home. That's true. 3 of them have, but 10 came home under Obama. He says there have been no tests for over almost a year. True, but there have been similar stretches in time where there have been no tests, like in 2007. It could be, as Kim said in his New Year's Day speech last year, that the things work now, so he doesn't need to test them anymore. Pakistan hasn't tested for a while. It doesn't mean they don't have a nuclear weapons system. Punggye-ri, the nuclear test site that they detonated, although the smoke was very white, which shows it was a superficial detonation, that collapsed on the 6th test. It's no longer useful. The missile testing launch pad sites, Tongcheri and Sohae, they're both fixed missile and liquid fuel. The real action is mobile launchers and solid fuel. Trump, I'm sick of him criticizing others and past presidents. We shouldn't be bad-mouthing former US leaders on the world stage. If anything, it just encourages people to hold out till the next leader comes around. And he keeps saying everyone else has failed at this situation. Again, this is not the outside world's fault. This is North Korea's choice to go down this world. I see Korea policy as a tremendous success. If you consider that North Korea attacked South Korea in 1950 and controlled it all the way down to Busan, and now you have one of the world's largest economies and successful democracies on the doorstep of this hell and aggression, I think that's a tremendous success story. So instead of saying whose fault is it that North Korea has nukes, who should get the credit for the fact that South Korea is the success story today that it is? Another thing, Vietnam, you know, they were able to open up to the outside world for their economy once they unified and US troops left. It was also after Ho Chi Minh died. And mainland China was able to open up once much of the world and the US was about to switch diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing as the one China. And also by then, its economy was larger than Taiwan's, and Mao was dead. So long as Kim is around and US troops are still in the South, there's no way he can open up his economy. That would be a suicide mission. What can we look forward to in this summit? I guess the real thing that would get attention is if that Kim offered something on the Yongbyon nuclear plant. But again, would there be inspections? Would it be the plutonium, which is kind of yesterday's news, or would it be uranium enrichment, which is where the real action is? Plus, we know of at least one other uranium enrichment site, Kangsong, and there could be others. There are other undeclared missile sites, all of which is fine. I mean, I expected that. Just don't, be having parades just yet. Depends what announced tomorrow. What really worries me, Trump might give some sanctions relief. I think we should be not only upholding the current sanctions, but sanctioning and cutting off the U.S. correspondent bank accounts of the mainland Chinese bank that handled North Korea's finances. It's a multinational gangster criminal enterprise state, and we need to follow the money and cut them off, because until the Kim regime is gone, those nukes are going to stay unless U.S. troops leave. What really worries me, and which I think Trump might do just because he likes to say he's the only one who could do stuff, is a peace declaration. That gets us down a very slippery slope to some kind of peace treaty, which is very dangerous indeed, because North Korea and South Korea will not recognize each other because both considers himself the legitimate government for the entire peninsula. And you can't sign a treaty with someone unless you recognize them. So if we were to sign a peace treaty with North Korea, that means we would be recognizing North Korea without them recognizing our ally. Similarly, in 1974, we recognized East Germany, but that was 2 years after the two Germanys officially recognized each other. We would have never recognized East Germany until the two Germanys worked out their thing. And this is 10 times worse because East Germany never attacked West Germany. So I have a feeling that Trump wants to say he's the peacemaker. He'll get the Nobel Peace Prize. He'll want to say, I ended the Korean War when nobody else could. And it's a peace treaty is a North Korean trap. Be very aware when you hear about it. Also, we have to think about our friends and the allies in the region, most notably Japan, which is the bulwark of the US alliance network in Asia. And Shinzo Abe, aside from his own tragic abductions issue, which has vexed Japan for generations, understandably so, he's very nervous that Trump is going to cut some kind of deal where Kim gives up his ICBMs that can hit the United States, but leaves the short range and medium range missiles intact. And Kim Jong-un is already on record as saying South Korea is not a target of North Korea's nukes because, again, as an ultranationalist regime of one Korea, Kim sees South Korea as his own territory, so he wouldn't spread nuclear fallout on his own earth. But Japan is fair game, especially with US troops there. So also any more cancellation of exercises in the South and or Trump ever leaves South Korea, which I think in his heart of hearts he wants to do, makes Japan very nervous because then they're the only country in Asia with US troops based there. And everybody like Jake Tapper, they get in Mike Pompeo's face about that June 13th tweet that Trump sent out when he got off the plane and he said, there's no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea. You know what? I gave him some grief over that too, but I'm starting to think about it. You know what? He may have been right in one sense. What if in Singapore in that private meeting, he cut a deal with Kim? He says, I'm going to give you a peace declaration or I'll downsize US troops in South Korea if you promise to dismantle the ICBMs. I can then say I've safeguarded the US homeland. Japan, too bad about them. Korea, you take care of that. So I think Shinzo Abe has every right to be nervous, and I think Trump may be looking to cut a deal where he takes care of America first, but not our allies. The only way that Kim Jong-un will ever get us nukes, just based on what I've heard him say over the years and the time he's invested, is if US troops leave South Korea, we remove South Korea from the nuclear umbrella, and we dismantle the US-South Korean alliance. Before the Singapore summit, I said on Bloomberg that I was cautiously pessimistic. I would say I'm openly pessimistic this time around. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. Go ahead, George. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, John. And thank you all for being here. And thanks to our audience on the live stream with us today. I want to begin by saying what might have been the cluster of expectations most fair-minded security analysts in East Asia or around the world might have had for this kind of summit. You know, what might it have addressed? Let's talk about what the rumors are that fairly soon in 3 hours it may address or may have already addressed behind closed doors. It's the session and supposedly a 2-hour working group meeting later today. What should have been on the table after the Singapore summit? Sean outlined well what was there and also his concern about some of the dimensions. The agenda that should have been set by advanced teams but wasn't should have been, where are we with regard to nuclear denuclearization on one or both sides? And I'd be happy if it was one and also equally happy if it was both, because then the North Koreans would be pushed to specify exactly what's in their heads and what's in their policy vision of the way denuclearization is a shared dynamic. We haven't had that. We have experts like Sean and others rightly tell us what traditional thinking from North Korea has been, and I think that's all we have to go on. Military issues, the future of exercises, the dynamic of U.S. presence on the peninsula would have been on the table. Regional concerns, that is, yes, we are two foes dealing with the core issues, but we both have a heritage of six-party talks. We both have our own allies and discussions in the region. Particularly Mr. Kim has been very active with Russia and China over the last 6 months. The United States less so with its ally in South Korea and Japan, but those are all in the mix. And of course, the issue of political discussion that produces security arrangements, like how to deal with the past, the history of the war, and finally, economic sanctions. That's the stuff of a two-day summit. It's very clear, not only were a number of these issues not on the table in grandiose form, let's talk generally about the region. Let's talk about 20 years from now when all sides are denuclearized. It's clear that neither was the expertise on the US side or the disposition clear to be able to do that. But the small leakage we have in the early part of today is what the US basically brought to the table would be a peace declaration, not a treaty, but a declaration of the end of hostilities, which may or may not have tied to it both sides saying, we agree to mutual non-aggression. How strongly the US is pushing this or whether or not they'll even raise it may be a function of how they read the acceptance by the North of this notion of an end of war declaration as opposed to a peace treaty. I think Sean has outlined well the multiple dilemmas with a peace treaty. And that's even before we get to the notion that you'd have to bring it to a US Senate and it engages in a domestic argument in the US. I may want to say some things about where we are domestically on this towards the end of my remarks. So we're not dealing at all with the core issue. We're dealing with the dynamic of bringing hostilities formally to an end of sorts. Of course, it doesn't deal with South Korea, as Sean has rightly pointed out, and it leaves a number of things left hanging based on what all the fine print will be. Of course, one of the characteristics, like in Singapore, of this particular exchange is we don't have large-scale working teams already presenting their leaders with what might be a first draft of the fine print, and these things going through by the leaders saying, that's unacceptable, I'll compromise on this in exchange for yours. This is not a negotiation. This is not a summit in the tradition of, I'll give a little bit here, you give a little bit there. Let's clear the table of some issues and talk about how we'll work down the line with the most difficult ones that we can agree about. This is a kind of discussion. It's a photo opportunity. It's a necessary domestic reality for both of these folks and for their positioning internationally. There simply is not enough work done by advanced teams for long enough with enough experts around the table, particularly from the United States on nuclear issues, to be able to anticipate something significant on denuclearization or military. We'll get the statement, I think, about a declaration of the end of hostility. We probably will also get an agreement on both sides of the establishment of formal liaison offices, which is something short of course, establishing an embassy, but it is opening direct communications with one's own diplomatic corps, and sometimes in these arrangements, military liaisons, country to country. We would still probably have the most formal relationship with the Swedes when Sean is taken by the government, peeking across the demilitarized zones. We'll have to deal with the Swedes, but our liaison office can serve a very good function. But compared to the other issues on the table, it's very, very low on the military and security and nuclear side. It's high on the symbolism side. So you have a symbolic declaration of an end of hostilities, which has some historical and cultural meaning, but not what it might have given the absence of this between North and South. It pushes aside the notion that this was a UN-sponsored armistice and the dynamic of the Security Council and others in that. It's a very good, feel-good thing coming out of the summit, but its substantive dynamic for denuclearization or military security or the level of threat will be minimal. It's probably clear that Pompeo, despite public rhetoric, is willing to give some space on the sanctions relief side. I think the North Koreans, of course, are coming with a maximal position on this, particularly get off our back financially so we can have legitimate investment and other things in a variety of ways. That's a non-starter from the US side. But what we're likely to do is to do a kind of symbolic taking off on sanctions on the Kumkwang tourist zone, the mountain where you can go skiing and do various things there. I don't know if we'll go so far as to allow the South and the North to be free of sanctions and, for the reestablishment of the Quezon industrial zone, which seemed in its heyday of exchange between North and South before the 2006 dynamic seemed to be working very well for both sides. This may just produce too much income for the North in certain ways that the US is not willing to give yet. I suspect there'll be some statement on the US side that would meet the kind of economic puffery argument. That is, in this exchange, we have seen a vision of the North which is prosperous like Vietnam, which will be a source of economic stability and vibrancy, et cetera. And we stand on the building blocks of the non-aggression between powers and the small, steady reopening of economic exchange and political exchange, with no mention whatsoever in a document of denuclearization or of the military dynamic. The extent to which that will be discussed actually in the working group and whether it's secret arrangements are not made, we just won't know until a good deal of time lapses and or the Congress decides to have substantial hearings on what happened in Hanoi, which is something they tried softly after Singapore and were met with folks who said, we trust the president. You see the four-pronged declaration. We stand on that. And everybody feels good because missile testing and nuclear testing has abated. Let me say something about the testing dynamic. I'm actually a little bit more optimistic than Sean on the advantages of the tests continuing to be held in advance. The first is for a number of the short-range missiles, I think it's fair to say they did not have a sufficient number of tests under different kind of either climatic or other conditions to have what I would call a sustained strike force in the regional zone. Now, you don't need a sustained strike force if what your somehow mental state is militarily, if we drop one or two bombs on Tokyo, that's all we have to do to achieve victory, or you have some other calculus that the rest of us don't understand. But what is clear is that from a either conventional military posture and certainly from a nuclear short-range missile posture, if they are making progress on the nuclear side, it's on changing the weight dynamics and the character and quality of the fissile material that goes into the bombs. They've tested a payload in the existing short-range missile systems, which was the state of the art of what they had in 2012 or 13. And so what they have in 19 doesn't match what their capable testing showed in 2012. That may mean you could aim at Tokyo and it lands in the Sea of Japan. And I think most of their military and technical people understand that, but they're trying to make improvements without that kind of testing, and they're happy with there being no intrusions into that process. Whether it's people on the left in the United States or people on the right, the hardened military and other people who feel very strongly that this regime in North Korea can't be tested and will try to maximize its nuclear advantage as best they can, there's a sort of shared underlying first and second step that must happen if we're serious about a sustainable peace that has anything to do with nuclear and military stuff. And that is, we need at the first stage a full documentation and declaration of the available fissile material that's held and where it's held in North Korea. I would associate myself not only with that, but I'd also like an accounting of the biological and chemical weapons that we know are also present. This is a WMD issue, that is weapons of mass destruction, not just a nuclear issue, especially given medium and short-term range delivery systems that we know they have. The second step in that would be after the documentation is provided or consistent with the documentation being provided. Certainly Yongbyon undergoes complete destruction and Pojeri does a final deconstruction in ways that can be verifiable. It's also the case that that would be a point in time where the United States in particular, but maybe Japan as well, would share their satellite and air reconnaissance with the IAEA and say to the IAEA, if there's a way in which you can be introduced as inspectors internationally to guarantee that those facilities are shut down and you can measure the fissile material that's declared. We also think you ought to look at these two sites where we think are secret sites and the openness of North Korea to seeing those things. That would be a position which from my point of view, if we reach between 1 and 3 years from now, would be a significant way to think about the denuclearization threat, but not the full denuclearization until we can wrap up the fissile material and do away with it. Second thing that I think has to happen, politically, diplomatically, a North Korean regime must rejoin the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, thereby making itself subject to a set of standards that also have to do with safety, which is very, very important. In my time in the panel of experts in 2010, 2011, I was stunned by not only the fear generated by military activity in the North at the time, but particularly in the wake of Fukuyama, the meltdown of the facilities in Japan, the concern about leakage in substandard nuclear reactors and substandard production facilities that might occur either from earthquake or storm, or obviously by the difficulty of the building itself in which it was below standard and would leak under certain conditions. So the environmental and dynamic and the political dynamic of the NPT, I think, is critical. I'll leave because Sean has put out some good ideas about concerns about the demilitarization of the island, the leaving of US troops. I won't touch any of that. But it seems to me that the fundamental dilemma of this summit, the prior one, and all the exchanges we've had when Pompeo and his counterparts have met is there is no roadmap, there is no plan. There is no sense of over the next 3 to 5 years, here's how we relieve sanctions against you in exchange for what you will do, which is a fundamental redirection of your nuclear and military program and a fundamental redirection even now of your economy. It's not that that plan isn't capable of being constructed, is it's not seen as a political priority by the United States. And for all the reasons that Sean has cited about Kim maintaining his strength posture and maintaining the dominance of the North, it's not first on their list either. They want the sanctions off. They're willing to do any number of things in up to a level to get reduction in that. And I think the next stage is to continue to make the United States the bad guy in this dynamic of imposing sanctions. I will tell you from my discussion with those who followed me and others on the panels of experts is that Kim's ability to beat the targeted financial sanctions throughout East Asia and Southeast Asia is stronger now than it was in 2015 and in 2012. The shadow companies, the illicit banking networks, the kinds of sensibilities that his agents have developed in the field for how to find a way to continue to generate cash back to the North is at a peak level. And whatever you hear about maximum pressure sanctions are working, is maximum pressure sanctions are working on coal and oil and on some of the materials that we would want constrained from the North going to other countries, particularly conventional weapons. But maximum pressure sanctions are not working in the banking, financial, and other industries. Be curious to hear what you have to say about that, since that's your bread and butter. So I think I'll stop there. We have a good audience here. Take questions as people would like to shoot them at us. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, George. Before I want to jump out to the audience, I want to do a couple of things. First, I just want to thank anyone that's joined us online. We're streaming online, so thanks for joining in. And we may, in fact, field questions from listeners online, viewers online. But before that, I just want to ask for my own interest of both of you. If we step back and we look at sort of a higher altitude picture of what this summit is about in terms of US and North Korea, I'd also like to ask for your opinions on one, what would seem like a loss or a completely rejiggering of US influence in Asia, but especially Northeast Asia. And then part and parcel to that, what does this mean for the balance of domestic power in Asia? Especially we see it in Vietnam, the summit's taking place. Sean, of course, mentioned Japan, which is a key player. And then last but certainly not least, what's happening in China also is it's a little unusual in that Xi Jinping has his own domestic tensions going on. So how do all of these things feature into the summit, and what might any particular outcome of the summit do to influence these various factors?
I think by leaving Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, Trump definitely weakened U.S. influence in Asia and turned over a lot of these countries to mainland China, sort of left them on their own. He's been very strong on Taiwan, but elsewhere, I think he's pulled back from Asia. And certainly by agreeing to suspend the military exercises in South Korea for 8 months, that's definitely made people question the U.S. commitment to alliances in Asia. And I know Japan is very concerned. So I really think Kim can almost taste this now. He's got the perfect storm where he has a nuclear deterrent that people think works. He has a nationalist left president in the South who wants to engage. You know, now Moon Jae-in wants to have railways across the border. He wants to reopen Kaesong, Mount Kumgang. His predecessor, Park Geun-hye, who's in jail, you know, she went around to every country with a list like Rex Tillerson did 2 years ago of all the North Korean businesses in their country. She said, if you want to continue to do business with South Korea, you have to shut these people down. So while the previous South Korean government was strangling the North, this one seems to want to finance it. And I always called maximum pressure moderate pressure at best, because they are definitely exploiting loopholes in Russian and mainland Chinese banks, others, but particularly those two, mainland China in particular, to transfer their money around the world. Think of North Korea as an organized crime family and follow the money. So I think at our expense, mainland China gains. You know, there's so much distrust and hate between North Korea and China. People don't appreciate that. The Korean War cost Beijing Taiwan. And historically, as an ultranationalist regime, Korea resents having been a tributary state to China. There's also a border dispute between North Korea and China over Mount Paektu, which is the holy birthplace of the Korean god king, whom Kim Jong-il derives his lineage from, even though he was actually born in the Soviet Union. But as you know, China was trying to get us to suspend our military exercises in South Korea for decades. And now one day alone with Kim in Singapore, and Trump says, sure. So I think China sees itself picking up at our expense. So I think net, depending on how this next summit goes, it's a general loss of U.S. influence and a general increase in mainland Chinese influence.
I think I share that. I'd share it emanating for some different reasons. I think we were in trouble, Patrick, early on when there was a pretty lax attitude toward the appointment of major figures as ambassadors to a number of our allied countries, particularly to South Korea. The notion that it took them over a year to come to appointing an ambassador and then pulling him back because he would not agree to a strategy that might involve selective bombing of targets in the north, and then waiting another 6 months to confirm an ambassador whose greatest amount of expertise was Japan, not South Korea. And we've had a number of difficulties in which many of the states we might rely on as good partners feel that U.S. influence at its first level is related to the kind of ambassadorial staff and main ambassador you appoint. And we've been weak in that regard, which is then in tandem with the TPP and other difficulties that Sean has mentioned. I think that on the balance of the domestic politics, I'm not an Asian expert in any stretch there, but what's very, very clear to me is that even if you're not yet at maximalist sanctions and you want to make those try to work, it's very difficult to have a trade war with one of the linchpins that's going to help you with maximalist sanctions. And the extent to which our America First strategy, if that's what it is, yields the kind of trade and hostility difficulties to the Chinese, even given the Chinese and North Korean antipathy, really creates conditions in which we shoot ourselves in the foot, either politically, diplomatically, but especially economically. And to the extent to which that puts pressure on Chinese leadership to be a particular way, I leave that to others who are more expert than me in this area.
If I could do 2 follow-ups, I think China can walk and chew gum at the same time. They're going to separate economics from security. I think even if we were having good trade relations with us, they would still enable and backstop North Korea because they don't want a U.S. ally on its border at all costs. And I think Trump's going to choke on his trade battle with mainland China anyway. So I think that's going to be over pretty soon. also in terms of U.S. influence in Asia, not to lecture, but there is something to be said for moral leadership and values. And, we get a little, it's dangerous, politically loaded to talk about human rights, but at least let's say the inhumane suffering and pain of the North Korean people. Trump was very moving in his first State of the Union speech, or his second last year State of the Union speech, and his speech to the South Korean Assembly, when he spoke of Otto Warmbier's death and the massive human rights abuses in North Korea, which were uncovered by the UN's Commission of Inquiry. I haven't heard him talk about that a lot lately. And this morning, the one bit we did see, he kept saying what a good guy. I could only find coverage of the summit on Fox because CNBC, MSNBC, and the rest of the fake news outlets, they're obsessed with Michael Cohen. So I had to go to Fox for actual news, if you can believe that. So, but he kept saying, Kim's a great guy, Kim great. How do Otto Warmbier's parents feel hearing that? If you got to meet with them, fine. But don't be telling everybody what a great guy and a good friend he is. An American student is dead because of his regime. So I think there is something to be said for moral leadership. By not mentioning the North Korean people's suffering, we give up some of that too.
Thank you both. Open it up to questions from the audience. We start, Julia.
Hi, I'm Julia Thomas in the History Department. I have two questions. One has to do with our relations with South Korea for career people in our State Department. How many of those people are still with us and whether they're being able to maintain strong ties. The second question has to do with Japan and its security concerns. How much are you hearing about the development in Japan of nuclear weapons?
State Department somewhat depleted. A lot of people left early. We still don't have an Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia. But I think Korea has become an area of interest for Trump. And I think he's gone from calling Moon Jae-in an appeaser in September 2017 to I think now he talks to Moon Jae-in more often than he talks to Shinzo Abe, because they're sort of giving each other cover on opening up to North Korea. So I think Trump, and he's also settled the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. He's out of TPP, which Korea was never part of. And now he wants Abe to do an FTA, but Abe's dragging his feet. So I think South Korea is kind of in vogue in the Trump administration right now. They're sort of giving each other the cover they need. And on Japan, we always said that there was a thing called Korea passing. Koreans felt that their country was being discussed by Japan, China, Russia around them without their input was what to do with North Korea. Now I would say there's a case of Japan passing. It's almost like Kim's meeting with everyone except Japan, and he has the abduction issue. I think the officials from Japan are going to Hanoi to stalk Trump people outside the hotel just to find out what was said. Honestly, I mean, that's what NHK says. So I think Japan feels left out. It's a reversal. I still don't see any appetite in Japan for nuclear weapons. The country almost came to a standstill, tore itself apart, just trying to reinterpret Article 9 for collective self-defense with U.S. Marines and defending the Senkakus. I don't see how the only country to have suffered a nuclear attack would actually go nuclear. South Korea doesn't need the nukes because they're not a target. And Taiwan, anything we do, we're their only supplier, so we would put the kibosh on that pretty quick. So nuclear proliferation, while it's a concern of mine in other parts of the world, thanks to North Korea in some part because they helped build that Syria reactor and they've also transferred technology to Pakistan. In Northeast Asia, I'm not concerned about it.
The only thing I'd add is with regard to South Korea, don't forget they've just agreed to up by about 22% their financial compensation or burden for paying for American troops, which is a real victory for Trump, given the tensions he's had with NATO and other countries that people our country allies are not paying their fair share. So that adds to the kinds of dynamic that I think Sean has mentioned.
It's like a protection racket.
Yeah, it is. The State Department and staff that I think mattered with regard to East Asia is down by about a third in terms of real numbers. And despite the proclamation by Pompeo when he came in to replace Tillerson that the draining is over, there are key people we need, et cetera, there you are again, Susan Thornton as a temporary, unconfirmed appointment, holdover from the Obama administration has done, at least in my mind, a sensational job. But the notion that you're 2 years in and you still don't have an Undersecretary of Free State Affairs is embarrassing for a modern state.
And also on the renegotiation for the troops in South Korea, it was only a 1-year deal and it used to be 5 years. So it means we're gonna have to go through this every year, which makes it more likely that Trump would at least contemplate the idea of pulling out troops if Kim gives him a deal that he can crown as a victory. So I'm worried that we're gonna have to go through this every year as opposed to every 5 years.
Thank you. Ashley?
Hi, I'm Ashley Rowland with the Kellogg Institute. How badly has the cancellation of the joint military exercises hurt military readiness?
Yeah, well, I'm no military expert, but I hear from people that it does cause military readiness and forces to atrophy if they haven't worked together. You got to practice there's been talk in the past of having the U.S. South Korean military exercises off the peninsula so as not to upset North Korea. But you got to train where the action's going to take place. And we won't know until it's too late, I guess. But if you miss 8 military exercises, that can't be good. So ask a defense person, but it certainly can't be anything positive.
I'm certainly not a defense person. I've been accused of being a peace person more than a defense person some of the time. But I do think that I would take the claims about the dramatic decline in military readiness with a grain of salt for a couple of reasons. The first is what has not changed is the virtual planning structure and the continued communication between South and us, and contingency planning based on changing North capabilities. I'm much more concerned that the dynamic of that unilateral move, which could have dramatic impact in a structured negotiation process, produced no concomitant concession from the other side. And of course, that it was declared without in combination of our cherished ally, who was also affected by this right in the region. If one wanted to talk about, as I mentioned, there's no plan going forward, we've missed the planning opportunities from the start. The notion that an American president would meet directly one-on-one with the leader of North Korea is historically, practically, and in terms of bargaining, hugely significant, and begs the question, what's your next move, Mr. Kim? And that occurred, and then therefore the proclamation occurred as a style of celebration without any real concessions from the other side. The decision to forego the military exercises, not once, but in a couple of cycles, has produced no concomitant military or strategic concession, even the promise of one on the other side. There is a logic, and Laurie and others can tell us, of negotiation, which says a bold unilateral move frees possibilities of building a longer peace. But we've now built 1, 2, 3 unilateral moves without any expectation of concession. And that's what I think is more significant than the military readiness. There's been no political, strategic, or military gain from it on the positive peace side.
Hi, my name is Max. I'm a Georgia student. I have a question for Sean. So I'm trying to understand your arguments, why you believe that North Korea would not adopt the Vietnam or the China model to liberalize their economies and also at the same time maintain their grip on power. Because at least in the China case, which is a ethno-linguistic country as well, they have opened up, become prosperous, and also maintained a monopoly of power. But at the same time, when you look to the south, there's an island, Taiwan, that has become, which is also populated by the same ethnicity, that has become, in a way, more prosperous than China itself if you look at the GDP per capita. But you don't see Chinese people on the mainland questioning the legitimacy of the Chinese state. So I'm trying to understand that argument. Thank you.
Because China does not bill itself as an ethno-nationalist state. North Korea propaganda, especially the internal, says we are the true Korea. China bailed out North Korea from the Korean War, but there are no monuments to Chinese volunteers in Pyongyang. They say that America invaded the North and Kim Il-sung fought them back, when it was in fact Kim Il-sung invaded the South and China bailed them out. So they cut off all contact with the outside world. You can't even watch Chinese or Russian radio in North Korea. It's an ethno-nationalist state. China is a normal country. It interacts with other socialist countries. By the time that Deng Xiaoping said to get rich is get glorious, China was open with other countries and the Cultural Revolution was behind them. Also, by then, the mainland's economy was maybe 10 size the size of Taiwan. Countries like Canada, UK, and others, and the next year, the US had already recognized Beijing as a legitimate Chinese government over Taipei. So when China opens up and people see Taiwan, it's 1/5, 5% the size. There's no competition. If you bill yourself as an ethno-national state and you've been totally closed off to the world and you open up and there's a twice the size and infinitely richer right next door that's just as Korean as you are, people are going to ask themselves, why is the Kim regime in power? Because Kim cannot afford true peace. His justification for his people's suffering, misery, poverty, and reclusion from the world is that the US is getting ready for its second invasion. So he has to stay on a war footing. And the nukes make us think twice about coming to South Korea's defense if he were to invade or threaten them again. So if he opens up and he's just another normal country, there's no reason for him to exist and be the legitimate Korea. China didn't have to worry about that with Taiwan, just like Vietnam didn't have to worry about that because they already had unification and US troops left. So if North Korea opened, it would be the end of the Kim regime very quick, and Kim knows that. But the lesson he takes from Vietnam is get US troops out, unified, then open up because there's no competition.
So just a quick follow-up on that. So because a regime like North Korea's regime, as you describe it, in many ways, it needs to, in order to maintain power over its population, one of the things it needs is an enemy, a credible threat of an enemy that's waiting to invade and come and do terrible things. And that can be part of the propaganda, etc. We see that. Yeah, we saw that in China during the Cultural Revolution as well. So is Kim Jong-un running out of enemies now that he's meeting with Trump, he's meeting with South Korea, he's still okay with China? I mean, where's he going to go?
Well, I think his goal is, and Trump may entertain it, is that the US leaves South Korea. And then, because Moon Jae-in, who now says that Friday is the 100th anniversary of the Republic of Korea, he also 2 years ago, when he came into office, floated the idea of a confederation with North Korea that was shot down by the conservative opposition. But I know he hasn't let the idea go. So I think Kim's goal, which he's getting very close, he can taste it, as I said, is give Trump security from the ICBMs in exchange for the US leaving South Korea, in which case he then has a confederation with the North, or he quasi-rules the South. Then he doesn't need an enemy because there's no competition for his rightful place to rule. So I think he can live without an enemy so long as we leave the peninsula.
And I think I disagree fundamentally on this, not to pretend to know the mind of Kim per se, but it seems to me I take the New Year's address of last year very seriously. It's an equal two-legged monster of nuclear strength to protect the security and massive economic development for all. Now, the massive economic development for all and of the country is not out of altruistic or economic models that seeks to uproot the trodden, et cetera, but it is an opening in this exchange with the United States that our nuclear neutrality as a phase towards denuclearization can be bought. And so the more that Trump plays the dynamic of, look at this prosperous country, Vietnam, and there's ways in which we're happy to buy your nuclear weapons from you or buy your fissile material, the price keeps going up. And what he's able to do is, in addition to being a political and social dictator and repressor, he's also a very smart kleptocrat. And I think the notion of being able to run a financial criminal enterprise throughout the soft zones of particularly Southeast Asia would be fine, thank you, as Western money is pouring in to relieve suffering and to build up a new North Korea that someday might be able to confederate with the South, especially if you have thriving areas like 3 more kinds of caissons and things of this nature, that he knows he can maintain power strong enough and long enough without massive repression to have 3 decades of economic development, and then he knows he's outlived certainly at least 1 or 2, maybe even 3 US counterparts.
Thank you very much for coming out today, gentlemen. This is going to be really hypothetical too, but should the administration of the U.S. change in 2020, what sort of policy continuity do you expect to see from the Trump administration to a new administration? Again, hypothetical, especially if the policy is based on a lot of substance-free proclamations and closed-door wink and grin agreements between the executives.
Let me jump first on this one. Despite my own concerns and somewhat negativity towards missed opportunities in both summits, I do believe that it will be important for Kim, and certainly important on the US side, that whatever the party that's victorious in 2020 builds on this, because there are significantly different inroads made now than we thought were possible 3 or 4 years ago. The problem is, this is the best metaphor I can come up with. It's a little bit like we had an empty lot and a group of us stood around and said, you know, we can build a really nice house there. And the first group that has some materials and has the ability to get to the lot builds something that we think looks like a shack, keeps a little bit of the rain out, but not a lot, serves certain kinds of functions, but we may have to dramatically reinforce, rebuild, maybe even start certain things from scratch, but the foundation may be able to hold for us. We're going to have to redo, a really big redo. And it starts with the notion of understanding our regional partnerships, that we are only as strong as a United States projection of force or diplomatic strength based on the partners we have. This is something that demands lots of systems thinking rather than what's the X we've got to cause Y with or cause Z that a new president or a new administration would bring with them. We'd need a new relationship with China, a different relationship with Russia. Both of those are likely to happen in a new administration, and certainly a greater understanding that our partners of Japan and South Korea have been isolated way too much in this dynamic. It will take a very skilled administration, and I think we have them on both sides of our political parties, to be able to socialize Mr. Kim into a new but vibrant dialogue that now is on a different schematic, both geographically, ideologically, militarily, and in terms of getting towards a goal. But again, if we say to Kim, look, after 60 years of hostility, we suspect it'll take a lot longer than a decade to get where we both want. That creates a plan, and it enhances the somewhat temporary stability that we do have, and builds from there.
Well, it all depends what happens between now and the next election, and it depends on who wins. But one thing I will say is that a lot of Democrats are being dishonest in their criticism of Trump for meeting with Kim, because a lot of these are the same left-wing Democrats who have always advocated reaching out without condition to our adversary. Now, Obama ended up actually being pretty tough on Korea while he was in office, but as a candidate in 2006, I remember him talking about unclenching his fist. And he said in the campaign against McCain, he would meet without preconditions with Kim Jong-il. Now, things changed a lot once he got into office, but Trump is not doing anything that a lot of Democrats have not advocated. So it looks like I have problems with Trump's approach for my own reasons, but I think that some Democrats are trying to score cheap political points on this. It depends on which Democrat has elected, but I think that probably certain Democrats would be much more committed to our alliances and would do things more in concert multilaterally with our alliances. So I think that Kim is going to try to get as much as he can out of Trump before he leaves office. That's for sure.
Let me jump a generalization on top of that. I think what we're seeing at 10,000 feet is that the idiosyncratic approach to foreign policy that Trump has used, and in this case seems or touts the notion of great success, has actually pushed democratic foreign policy in thinking about situations like this far more to the right than it would have been, because the oversimplification for the Democrats is, We've got to strengthen the alliances. We can't keep giving away unilateral concessions without some corresponding security guarantees. We've got the dialogue, but Mr. Kim better understand that we're strong and we're stable and we're going to go ahead in a programmatic way. And we need more creativity and more diversity of the approach to them than that. But not only in this area, but with regard to Europe, and I think even with regard to Latin America, the oddities and idiosyncrasies of this administration's approach to foreign policy has brought out the worst of the Democratic left to be too far left and the worst of the centrists to go to the right.
And a lot of Democrats today sound like Reagan Republicans from the 80s. Absolutely. I mean, the way they're talking about Russia is the way a lot of scaremongering happened on the right. And I would disagree on one thing. I think South Korea maybe was isolated early on, but since then, Moon Jae-in has worked very closely with Trump. I think South Korea is in vogue right now in DC, and Japan's on the out.
Do you think Trump's modus operandi here is simply to score a foreign policy win for his administration at any cost?
You know, I heard people saying that Trump may not be able to focus because of what's going on with Michael Cohen, or he's worried about Mueller. I don't think Trump cares about that. I think he compartmentalizes. I think everything he's doing in Korea is on track with what he's been saying about foreign policy and alliances in general for the last 30, 35 years. I think he wants to do it because he wants to do it. What I do think is, I think he wants to be the president who can say he ended the Korean War. And he did something that nobody else did. I don't think it has anything to do with domestic politics. I just think it's the way he focuses on himself and he personalizes everything. And, you know, he's always talking about Xi's a great guy, Kim's a great guy. You know, meanwhile, they represent brutal dictatorships, one more than the other. And then when it comes to Justin Trudeau, Angela Merkel, or Theresa May, people elected by their governments who allies are, he has no time for them at all. So I think this is Trump's classic personalization of foreign policy.
And Patrick, I'd like to think he does calculate costs and benefits in certain foreign policy decisions, but I don't have any evidence of that.
Fair enough.
And, you know, and I don't mean that facetiously. I'm sorry. You know, thank you for laughing, but it wasn't meant as a joke. I think he believes in what is the nature of the opportunity, and if I can command the opportunity to such a grandiose nature, it only has payoffs. And I'll worry about critiques and what the next step may be later, and I'll invent it as I go along.
Gentlemen, second row there.
Thanks. I'm Laurie Nathan, Kroc Institute. I find much of the discussion misleading and confusing and incoherent around North Korea and US-North Korea relations, because the debate is preoccupied with strategy and tactics and bargaining dynamics rather than with objectives. And strategy or discussion on strategy makes no sense if you don't have clarity on objectives. So structure follows strategy and strategy follows objectives. And the debate that we appear to be having around strategy and tactics is really a debate around objectives. So I think that's the critical focus for discussion. And the debate around objectives, a little beneath the surface, is a debate around minimalist versus maximalist objectives. In other words, if one's objectives were stabilization, reduce the risk of a nuclear war, then the strategies that emanate from that would be quite different from having as your objective denuclearization. However, that's defined. If your objective is respect for human rights in North Korea, or your objective is unification, then a whole bunch of different strategies follow. One can, of course, have different objectives. One can distinguish between short and long-term objectives. One can distinguish between objectives of allies or the global community represented by the United Nations, and one can distinguish between a best case desirable outcome and a most realistic acceptable outcome or objective. So I want to put it to you that that's really what the debate's around. And we kind of get confused when we debate what should or shouldn't be done without being clear on what the ultimate objective is. This is not a criticism simply of the Trump administration. It's a criticism of the way the debate is happening. And by contrast, I think the debate publicly on Iran is a debate around objective. Whereas here, it ought to be around objective, not primarily around strategy and tactics.
And I think part of the reason for that, Laurie, and it's very good of you to point out, is that there was no desire on the part of the United States to talk about objectives except for domestic purposes in the US. That is because we knew that FFVD, final, fully verifiable denuclearization, was a non-starter, but it was important to lay out there for domestic consumption in the US is this is the way we're going to keep security, and this is the way you're going to feel better in light of a potential nuclear threat, but we're going to achieve all these other objectives, which are really strategy. There are ways in which, with the US, the Soviets did work out in the 70s and 80s a shared set of objectives about rejection of nuclear war, minimize the notions of possible mistakes, find a way to have equity or parity that we both have a sense of strategic stability that we could sell to our domestic constituents. And from that came the arms control agreements. There's no hope, expectation, and I'd say no stomach in this particular Trump team for the deep, consistent, long-term, engaged discussion that would get to an objective that's important to us. So the closet or ghost or shadow objective was lessen the perception that this is a nuclear threat. And then the debate in the United States with regard to strategy is, are we living with North Korea a nuclear state, or are we not? And are we willing to say that or not? And I think it'll be interesting to see if that discussion gets shaped not only by whatever outcomes are shared with us about this summit, but it also, I would say, has to be shaped and formed in looking at what's happening right now in Kashmir. Because we've heard for 2 decades, well, we may just have to live with Pakistan and India being nuclear states. They got their own strategic balance. I guess we're okay. Well, we may be on the verge of not being very okay at all there, given the quick escalation.
Well, I think the Kim regime has an objective, and that's they're very clear thinking about this. So they have an objective and they have a strategy, and they want the U.S. out. I'm just a private citizen. My objective is the end of the Kim regime and let Koreans live as one peacefully. Whether or not the U.S. government has an objective, I don't know, but sounds like they don't.
I'll just jump in here as well, Laura. I think you're spot on. It's an incoherent debate. And Sean, you're also right, because that's the rational actor. The problem is, as I see it, we don't understand Trump as a rational actor in the way we classically approach rational actors. We're all befuddled, and that's why I think we've just gone back to second base and asked, well, what's next? Are we just talking about various kinds of strategies or tactics? We have to talk about something, because in a way it's a projection of hopes for ideal outcomes, as well as plannings for less ideal outcomes. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
But I don't know if the U.S., now that you mention it, I don't know if the U.S. has ever had an objective when it comes to North Korea. I mean, in the Korean War, our objective was to roll back the invasion. And, just on that, the armistice was signed by a U.S. general on behalf of the UN command, and then General Nam for the Korean People's Army in the North signed it on behalf of his military and on the Chinese volunteers. The PLA didn't even fight, technically, because, of course, mainland China and both Koreas at the time were not even in the United Nations. So we didn't sign the armistice per se. We signed it for the UN command. But we had an objective, a very clear objective then, to roll back and to secure South Korea. I don't think any administration really has had an objective. No administration will come out and say, we want the end of the Kim regime to unify Korea. North Korea is very open about it, but we're not. Everyone's afraid to, but I think that has to be the end goal.
Well, this is just a silly point to make, I suppose, but then, because I also seem to remember that the Korean War was fought on our side under UN command, so I wouldn't think it's up to Trump to end the Korean War, because it wasn't just a US war, it was a United Nations military action. So I don't even think he can claim that.
You were a panel expert. I've been at a lot of events in New York where all US officials UN officials disavow ownership of the Korean War. So most UN people I know will say, it was a US campaign leading UN member states plus South Korea, because the Koreas didn't join until 92. And they are at pains to always remind us that it was not a UN body, the UN command. It was a US-led command of UN states, but it was not a UN body. So a lot of Americans who don't want to confront the peace treaty issue, they try to put it off in the UN. The UN says, no, it actually is a US issue. But the thing is, we didn't sign it on behalf of ourselves, and no country signed it, only military signed it. And Henri Ferrand, who is a young up-and-coming Columbia law postdoc who favors a peace treaty, but he says that not signing an armistice is not doesn't invalidate you from signing a peace treaty, and that the United Nations does recognize the two Koreas as the primary antagonists and belligerents in the Korean War. And despite North Korean propaganda, there's nothing to stop legally the two Koreas from signing a peace treaty with each other. So it's tricky, and maybe it's something we should have in the law school next time. But I think Trump, if he wanted to, he could actually make the declaration. But I hope he doesn't, because the conditions for peace don't exist.
And I remember one UN official when I was in New York just after the adoption of the JCPOA by the Security Council, the validation of that, said to me as we were coming out of the building, you know, this is going to be the model someday for Korea. That is, there will be a formal peace agreement between either the US and North Korea or South and North Korea, and then it'll be validated and accepted by the Security Council.
Just following up on this last point, the thread on objectives. If the ultimate objective is the end of the regime in North Korea and then a unification of Korea on the terms of the South, which is basically our terms, then isn't it rational for them to want nuclear weapons in order to protect them?
Totally rational.
Absolutely.
So then basically there is no negotiation, right? It's a unilateral sort of stand down, surrender, and then pretty much elimination or extermination of that regime, which is what we're. And so how do we conceive of a conversation or a way forward given this stance? I mean, can we conceive of a world in which we actually talk to each other, or we imagine the possibility of existing together despite differences that seem to be at the cosmic or ultimate scale?
There are a number of South Koreans who've thought quite deeply about this, who, while conceptually and historically saying there must be an end to the regime at the North, whoever is in charge, in order for us to have unification, they do have many different scenarios for a final objective of unification. Whether that unification has multiple steps along the way in terms of shared economic zones or a confederation or any number of other steps along the way that may take decades. There are those who consider in the South the relationship between full peace and unification to be one shared objective, co-participated by North and South and associated friendly others. They're less concerned about denuclearization because they would assume that will occur, as will regime change, maybe on both sides, as the success of continued cooperation builds over time. Now, some will call that dreamy, but our colleagues at Seoul National University have a very strong undergraduate and graduate program called the Peace and National Unification Program. They're spending a lot of time building a future in that. Again, if we think about our own learning about conflict transformation, John Paul Lederach's dictum in which you better take as much time to build the peace after the agreement as you were involved in the conflict, very few of us in this room will see this in our lifetime. But it doesn't mean that it has to deal with regime change in the traditional sense as we've known it for the last 40 years.
Thank you for that. So given this sort of gradual, dreamy scenario, isn't what Trump happens to be doing, despite his ultimate his own private objectives, maybe of a Nobel Prize and whatever megalomania he brings to the table, or both of them. Maybe it's an irony of history that the combination of the megalomanias will result in cessation of hostilities and a dreamy kind of outcome. But the first step would be to stop demonizing each other and to ramp down the rhetoric. And as far as that goes, you know, the dream is on.
The dream was also on between 1992 and 1998 and between 2002 and 2006. We've had this dream before. There have been structural, political, leadership dynamics that have stalled it. So we don't need a new movie in town for this. And whatever role Donald Trump and that administration will play, we do have the ability to build from that, whatever its strengths or inadequacies. I think the question is, if you look at the 30-year history, there have been enough bursts of increase of goodwill and possibilities of coexistence and demilitarization of threat that there's reason to go forward no matter what the outcomes from Hanoi, but it's still important for people with analytical, conceptual, and historical commitment to that area to say, let's look at what's missed. You know, I can cut my arm on this glass and you can quickly give me a tourniquet and stop the bleeding. But then if you walk away and say you're fine now, sooner or later, this thing's going to open up again and there's going to be infection and I may die from bleeding to death. We need expert dynamic cooperation on both sides to make this happen.
Yes, we've seen this dream before, sort of like a recurring nightmare. I never said that it would be unification on the South's terms. I said Koreans should be able to free to choose as they wish, whatever that may be. I know there's a reflexive default view of Germany, but it's a very different situation. Germany, the population west to east was 4-1. It's only 2-1 from South to North Korea. Also, Germany was in NATO and the Soviet Union was intact for a full year after German unification. So there was still this perceived instability or enemy outside. And it was the East German collapse was part of a greater East European story. And remember, the change in East Germany was never about unification until after the wall opened. Unification will be the driving force from the beginning of anything that happens in Korea. There is no external threat once the North Korea issue is solved. So it could be that you have an independent, non-aligned, united Korea free of an American alliance. Like it wouldn't stay in the American alliance the way united Germany stayed in NATO. So I'm not assuming it would be on the South's term. It would be on new terms for Koreans themselves to enjoy. And yes, we put nukes first in South Korea in 1958. We took them out in 1991. Kim Il-sung would have seen Khrushchev as selling out Castro in the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's around the early 60s. We now know from declassified Soviet archives that North Korea got serious about looking at its own nuclear deterrent because it doesn't trust foreigners for its own security. It's this ethno-nationalist xenophobia in the regime. So it makes perfect rational sense for Kim to keep his nukes if he wants to rule over the peninsula one day. And I think we get too caught up in the nukes and don't spend enough time looking at the regime in a holistic way. Even without the nukes, it's the fourth largest standing army in the world, most of which is forward deployed at the DMZ. And if we were serious about attacking North Korea, we would have done it before the nukes, but we couldn't because of the conventional threat to South Korea. So Kim is right and rational to keep his nukes if he wants his dream, because he can't survive so long as South Korea is there. We're not going to attack him, but he'll be undermined and overthrown by his own people if there's a healthier, bigger, larger, wealthier Korean alternative. That's the issue. But how they choose to live, that's up to them.
I think we have time for one more question here.
Sean, you mentioned that you think there's a chance that Trump entertains the idea of taking troops out of South Korea. What would the ramifications of that be short-term and long-term, in your opinion?
Well, short-term, I think then South Korea's days are numbered, and you would see immigration out of South Korea the way you saw a lot of people leave Hong Kong before they hand over to China. You see a lot of people, making backup plans. I think people would see eventually the ROK folding into North Korea. But really, it would open the door for China to expand in Northeast Asia, and Japan would start making plans too. And that would be, Xi Jinping would be licking his chops, because if he ever wants to move on the Senkaku Islands or Taiwan, that's 28,500 fewer US troops he has to deal with in that first wave or first attack. It would suggest an American retrenchment and exit from Asia. So I think it would send shockwaves across the entire continent and really around the world too, because Western Europe would then question our alliances too.
Well, I want to thank both of our panelists, George Lopez, Sean King, for taking their time and sharing their expertise with us. I know I've come away with a lot more information. I want to thank our audience as well for all of your great questions. If we could, round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.